be recorded, and we'll host it on most likely YouTube when the call is over. So you should have it shortly, within the hours after this session. So today, I will be hosting this call, but I'm glad to be joined by Rick, our lead engineer from Liquity, who has been working on the chicken bonds too, obviously. So Rick, I think you are on already.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Nice. So maybe we'll just give a few more minutes for the people to join, and we'll get started. I can give you a rundown of the planning, I guess. So based on the initial reaction, we try to make a plan that will explicit all the items of the chicken bonds. So we will start pretty basic by simply answering the question of why did we build the chicken bonds? What needs are they addressing? And then we'll dive more into what are actually the chicken bonds. And then I want us to spend a bit of time expanding on some core concepts of the product that are not clearly understood by everyone yet. So we'll discuss the bonding logic, how it works, and how it's different from the other bonding mechanism you might be used to. And then we'll dive into the yield amplification, which is a core part of the system. And it seems like some people are not getting it, and they are uneasy when they don't get it. And I definitely understand. So I really want to make sure this part is understood. And then after that, we'll probably deep dive onto those bTokens, so the boosted tokens you get when you chicken in. And after that, probably just explicit the rollout phases of the chicken bond, because just in case, as of now, we've released the white paper, but that's it. There is a white paper on the bounty. The rest is yet to come. And we might discuss the NFTs that are in the chicken bonds too, because I saw some questions about this one. So we'll go item by item. I'll give you a quick rundown / an intro. I'll probably let Rick add some details, and then maybe we can make it interactive and take your questions on an item basis instead of taking them all at the end. So you have a text chat in the community call channel. Brand new feature by Discord, yeah. So you can just type your question here as we go through the presentation, and we'll try to take them if they're relevant to our current topic. So hello, everyone. Just to get started on the why of the chicken bonds. Okay, so you're already firing up with the question. That's cool. We're going to answer this question about the bonding, right? It's a third item. But right now, I just want to give you slightly more context on the high-level picture of the chicken bonds, put it simply. So essentially, it stems from a need of liquidity, a need about our token, where, like most DeFi projects, there are challenges regarding the liquidity of LUSD and the LQTY token. Both tokens have different challenges regarding the liquidity, of course, because for LUSD, we have the question of the peg, that is another topic, where on LQTY, it's just a matter of having sufficient liquidity to stomach trades without too much slippage. But thinking about those questions, essentially, we've looked at the solutions that are currently available to grow liquidity on various tokens. And one of the ways I like to intro the chicken bond is as such, you can essentially regroup all the solutions that are used to grow liquidity currently in about two categories. The first one is liquidity mining. So that's the one that people are most familiar about. And it's simply the idea of giving some tokens to the liquidity provider of the pool you want to grow the liquidity on. So this one is simple, basic. It does work if the incentives are sufficient. We've seen some massive pool growth thanks to incentives mostly. But the problem is it's a continuous cost. And so to keep that liquidity, the projects need to keep providing emissions to liquidity providers. And it proves costly over time and can also have some consequences regarding the price of the token that is incentivized, because depending on the project and the specific of the liquidity mining program, essentially users people that are farming it are most likely to sell the token to realize their profit. So based on the observation of the limit of liquidity mining, Olympus, a while ago already, more than a year ago, came out with this idea of bonding. Let's call it Olympus-style bonding, because again, it's widely different from chicken bond-style bonding. And we'll deep dive into that in just a minute. So Olympus came with this idea of, essentially the main shift for them was, okay, right now all projects are renting their liquidity and they are facing those recurring costs that are quite important. What if instead of renting the liquidity, they bought it? And so that's the whole idea behind bonding, where essentially you provide some LP tokens of a token that is using Olympus Pro. And in exchange, you will get the native project token with a slight discount compared at the time of bonding, with a delay of 5 days usually, and some system use another delay. So it does fit the bill in the sense that it helps the project capture its liquidity. But here again, you have a problem of the cost of that liquidity, because the liquidity is not only paid at face value, but the project is also offering a discount to make it interesting for bonders. And so it translates into a heavy cost for the project. And depending on how they organize their campaign on ARM, can also translate into quite a significant selling pressure on the token, because here, once again, you're using the native token of the protocol massively as incentive. And so the people that are taking part in your game, their only way to realize their profit is to sell that token. So it creates a situation where you do capture the liquidity, but you create a significant selling pressure on the token, and there is still this question of a significant cost. So for Liquity, we were thinking of a way of essentially making this in a more efficient manner. How can we capture liquidity, but without going the usual route, which, as you have seen, involve significant distribution of incentives? And so the basis of the chicken bond is really like that, is a thought process to essentially harness the existing DeFi infrastructure there is on the token to both provide opportunities to holders that are willing to take part in this game, let's call it as such, and at the same time enable the project to capture some permanent liquidity that they can simply use to guarantee that, you know, a minimal level of support on their liquidity position. So that's the very basics of chicken bonds. There are no slides yet. I'll probably share some more later. That's the very basics of chicken bonds, is really picture it as a way of harnessing the existing DeFi infrastructure of a given token to create a kind of, let's call it a game between different players, where the players themselves, they can achieve better yield than if they would just use the token directly. And at the same time, they are helping the project capture a bucket of permanent liquidity that grows, that enable the project to sustain its own liquidity, but is also a key component of the system, because as this permanent bucket grows, so does the yield amplification of the whole system. So that's really the basics, and I realize we've introduced a lot of concepts here. So we'll probably take a minute to explicit them. So I guess, in terms of visual, we have some infographics that might help you just understand the process. So you might have seen some in the blog post we've shared already. But I guess the basic of the system is maybe to understand what's happening with the funds that are deposited into the system. And so we have this internal accounting logic we call the buckets. And essentially, there are 3 of them that capture the assets at different time and different moment of the system and enables all its core features. So I just shared with you an infographic that kind of illustrate them. And maybe we can start with going deeper into those buckets and give you the life cycle, let's say, of a user of chicken bonds, so you get a better understanding of how it works. So the very first bucket, the pending bucket, is where the asset goes when a user creates a bond. The challenge with this pending bucket is that since we guarantee the exit of the user at this stage at no cost, so it means that when you create a bond and you haven't chickened in or chickened out yet, you can recoup your full initial investment at any time. That's a chickening out process. And so to make sure this guarantee is offered by the system, essentially we have this pending bucket that receives the asset when they're in this bonding stage, and they are already deployed in a solution producing some yield, but it would be a solution that is free of impermanent loss, because essentially we need to be able to return the funds to the user if there is a chickening out. And so that's the main challenge of this pending bucket, is hosting the funds while the bonding is in progress and enabling user to recoup their full initial investment if they wishes to do so through the chickening out process. And then we have two other types of buckets. The other one are involved as soon as the user essentially chickens in, and this is when the split occur. And so you have the reserve bucket and the permanent bucket. So the reserve bucket, I guess, is in terms of the user, it's the most critical to understand. So the reserve is where the bulk of the accrual goes. And here again, there is an escape hatch, as we call it, where users can redeem against this reserve bucket the bToken they obtain to recover a corresponding amount of token. So essentially, it's another way of exiting the system. This time, there is a cost. It's not just like chickening out where you get the full initial face value of your investment. At the stage of redemption, there is a cost in terms of a fee that is paid, and that will serve as further incentive within the system. And finally, there is a third bucket, the permanent bucket, where a share of the tokens are sent when users are chickening in. And this permanent bucket is where the accrual, this is where the accrual of token for the DAO or the project occurs. So when we talk about capturing protocol-owned liquidity, this is in the permanent bucket that this liquidity accrues. And essentially, since this liquidity is permanently captured by the system, it can be dedicated to it can be deployed, in a yield source that has impermanent loss, such as a liquidity providing position, because at this stage, the liquidity is permanent. So there is no guarantee to the end user that we need to return his tokens if needs to be. So yeah, that's a rundown of the three buckets. And then the main logic to understand, and if you get this, you get the yield amplification, is that essentially all three buckets are producing yields, but only one bucket is getting the yield of all the others, and that's the reserve buckets. And that's how the yield amplification is achieved on the bToken token, essentially. Because the reserve token is backing the bToken, but it's not only composed of what's in the reserve, it's also fueled by the yield of the pending and the permanent bucket. And that's why we talk about yield amplification, because when you own a bToken, you essentially get your own basic yield, let's call it like that. That's the yield produced by the reserve bucket, but you're getting also additional yield coming from the tokens in the pending and in the permanent bucket, and that's your yield amplification. So I don't know, maybe Rick, you want to add to this? I tried to give like a full rundown, but I realized I've been a bit long.
That sounds good to me. I guess if there's any questions, I'll dig into answering those.
So there is a question about can the funds ever escape the permanent bucket?
Right. So in the generalized version that will be available kind of to other DAOs and projects as a permissionless protocol, generally no, like it would be permanently owned by that project. In the LUSD version that we're deploying, there will be a migration feature because one of the yield sources may upgrade. So we may need to kind of like unlock the permanent bucket and make it redeemable so that users can kind of migrate to a new instance. But that's kind of a special case. In the generalized version, it will be permanently owned.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of touches the next question you were asking, eightfold, about the governance of the protocol. So you know how the team operate at Liquity, and we're quite the governance minimizer, let's call ourselves like that. But here there's still a question, as we were touching with this discussion regarding the permanent bucket, a question that is more an operational question than a governance question. I will frame it as such, which is essentially the management of the funds in this permanent bucket. So when the Chicken Bond instance is created, maybe the best situation for those tokens is to whatever, let's say LP on SushiSwap, because there is an incentive here. But the situation might evolve as DeFi evolve, and maybe 6 months, 8 months down the road, the best place for those tokens is actually somewhere else. And so there is the question of making those decisions. It's still quite up in the air, I want to say. So we have several thought processes, and especially for the LUSD Chicken Bonds version. But for the generalizable version, so for Chicken Bonds that could be used by any project, it might be up to the project deploying the instance to kind of decide how those decisions are made. So another question regarding the permanent bucket from Rayton Vortex, asking if the permanent bucket can suffer impermanent loss, then this negative yield would also be reflected in the reserve bucket's yield. So essentially, we'll just reduce a bit the yield amplification for the reserve bucket, but at no time, what happened in the permanent, even let's put a kind of excessive example, but so you understand my point. If the permanent bucket goes to 0, nothing happened for the reserve bucket. The only thing is they no longer have the yield amplification from the permanent bucket. But really what needs to be understood here is the permanent bucket is kind of living its own life, giving away its yield to the reserve bucket, but the events in the permanent bucket are not having a direct impact for the funds in the reserve bucket. So in that sense, it's quite protected. Okay. So we have another question from Ronan McGovern. Let's see. I assume the underlying assumption is that it will help bootstrap V2 and V3 liquidity for LUSD on Uniswap. Is that correct? So for the LUSD version, we might share a bit more about it, and especially to give you more idea of how the concept of chicken bonds can be implemented, essentially. But before we go too much in depth, I just wanted to make sure we have everything covered in terms of the logic of the system. So I think for the buckets, we're quite clear. Seems like you guys have the basics. I just wanted to take a minute to go back to one of the first questions we got from Spikedoink about essentially the difference between, let's call it Olympus style bonding and chicken bond style bonding. So on this point, I really want to make clear that it's completely a different beast at all levels. And the highlight of the difference are as follow. With Olympus, you are bonding, so you're giving away some key asset to the protocol, the treasury of the protocol itself. And in exchange, you get some tokens. You have a waiting period, and that's all you can do. You cannot chicken out of an Olympus bond. Once you started the bonding process, the only thing you can do is wait for your tokens to collect. So that's one of the first difference, is this idea of escape hatches, as we call them. But essentially with the chicken bonds, at all the stage of the bonding process, you have an escape hatch. It's different depending on the stage you're in. So when you just created the bond, your escape hatch is essentially chickening out. And it means you will recoup your full initial investment and only have lost the opportunity cost of capital for the time you were bonding. And then once you've chickened in, so once you are a holder of the bToken, you essentially have, let's say, two different types of escape hatches. One that is dependent of the market condition, and that's simply the pool between bToken and token that will be on an AMM. So depending on the price on that pool, you might want to use it to exit. And if the situation of the pool is not interesting enough, there is always a path of redemption that kind of guarantees a minimal floor price for the bToken in terms of token. So that's like the first difference is modalities and optionality. With Olympus Bond, you only bond, you wait, you collect. No way of changing your mind. With chicken bonds, you have 2 to 3 escape hatches at different stages of the process. The other thing is really what is done with the fund. Because when you bond with Olympus, you are essentially giving away the assets you're bonding to the protocol. Protocol you have no claim upon. With the chicken bonds, your assets are within a system that you get a claim upon, because the bToken is essentially a claim on the assets that are contained on the system overall. So it's really, I'd say Olympus style bonding is a kind of external bonding where the token goes away from the system and you get other benefits, where chicken bonds is more internal. It's using a mechanism based on a generation of yield and its redistribution to grow the protocol on liquidity. But like really the rundown, I think, and that's critical to understand, is that essentially it's closer to pool together than Olympus, the way our bonding system works. Because thanks to all those escape hatches, your principal is not at risk, and what is at play here is the yield generated by this principal. So I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have more questions on the bond. Okay, I was just checking the chat. So yes, indeed, seems like you're getting it. The reserve bucket is essentially benefiting from the yield of the two other buckets. So the whole system redirects the yield to the reserve bucket, which is the bucket tied to the bToken. Let me see. Yeah, so another thing too, I think it's important to have in mind is that as user goes through the system and so more tokens enter, they bond, maybe they chicken in or maybe they chicken out, the reserve bucket grows. And so essentially the bToken correspond to a rising floor of the underlying token as the system matures. So overall, there are just way more guarantees, I want to say, that in a system like Olympus. So we have an interesting question from Mystery Box. What sort of failure happens if the unexpected occurs and there are losses instead of income on the tokens? Wow. So I guess the main source of that would be a technical risk, because as you probably understand, but I just want to explicit it, to achieve the yield amplifications, the assets are deployed, are invested into other protocols, and so the technical risk of the chicken bonds include the risk of the protocol that are used to produce the yields too. So there could be, let's call it a black swan event at this level. So for instance, let's say the yield is coming from a yearn vault and there is an actual issue with the yearn vault, an attack here or something. That's a risk, of course. But apart from the technical risk, the system is really designed to protect the principal. And this is why we can go with this pull together analogy, because it really seems like it's a designing principle of pull together too, where everything is done to guarantee the security of your principal. But then, of course, they cannot do magic, And just like on pull together, where if Avi gets hacked or whatever is the source of yield, there will be an impact for the depositor of pull together. It's the same logic that applies for the chicken bonds. You cannot wrap a DeFi product in a product that is less risky than the product that is being wrapped. That's like laws of DeFi physics almost.
We move on, Brice. What's up next? Apparently, Brice is having a couple of audio issues, so if you could just bear with us a minute or two, he's going to reconnect. Maybe I can answer a question or two in the meantime. Let's see.
Hi again. Can you hear me? Oh yeah, it seems to be working now.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that. I have no idea where this is coming from. All right. So where were we at? Let me just reopen the chat. So yeah, I think in terms of the basics of the system, we covered our tracks. Just maybe so that everybody is in the clear. So I think the first infographic we shared about the buckets really explicit what's happening with the funds within the system. That's really important to understand that. Really, I guess the key point with those buckets is they all have a different function, a different reason to be. So the pending bucket, its main goal essentially is to enable the chickening out. And so it's used in an impermanent loss-free source so that user can be guaranteed to recoup their full initial investment if they do chicken out. The reserve bucket is where essentially the bulk of the work happens. It's here to guarantees the bToken through the redemption mechanism, and it also accrue the additional yield of the other buckets. And then the permanent bucket, is really more pictured like the property of the DAO or the project deploying the instance of the chicken bond at the end of the day. It's this permanent bucket of token that can be then used to deploy liquidity, and then will also produce yield contributed to the reserve bucket. So each bucket have its function, and all three together achieve that yield amplification that we talked about. Maybe just another thing on the yield amplification. It's quite obvious, but not always. Since it's an amplification, it bears its name quite properly. So essentially, it means the yield amplification is more interesting the higher the base yield is, because it will achieve essentially a multiplier based on this initial yield. And so the situation is, of course, much more exciting if the base yield is, say, for instance, 20% than if the base yield is 3%. So there were some questions regarding the rollout. I think we mentioned in the tweets already that essentially the rollout will happen in several phases. So right now you're at the stage where we've released the white paper and we've offered a challenge to the community. We might talk more about this fair price formula bounty. The next step will be to essentially try out this new concept, and we want to try it out with a token of Liquity. Seemed to make more sense for us, both to solve the challenges we were talking about in the intro, so liquidity on LUSD and potentially the peg, but also to just test the system in the wild and see if it's indeed behaving as we anticipated. Because at the end of the day, this is, economic modeling is always a part of game theory, and it's about how the users will interact with the system. And at this stage, the only thing we can have are assumptions. We need to verify them at some point, essentially. So the LUSD chicken bonds would be the first instance, and it's essentially the guinea pig, if we can put it as such. That would inform then what we want to have after, which is a generalized version of chicken bonds that could be used by any project, ideally even in a permissionless manner where it's just an infrastructure projects can harness without even having to ask us. But that's more like the mature stage of the product. So, okay, I guess we have a bit more questions about Olympus. So Artemis asking, what would make a protocol want to use chicken bonds other than Olympus Pro? This one is super easy. So with Olympus Pro, they will need a massive budget. They will probably create a significant selling pressure on their token, as we've seen with most of the tokens that used Olympus Pro to this date. And yeah, they will capture liquidity. That would work, but that would be costly. With chicken bonds, they would need to have a yield source on their token. So that's a requirement you don't have on Olympus. But the plus side is that all they would need is time instead of money to accrue their liquidity. And it won't create as much significant selling pressure on the base token, because our way of doing it doesn't require significant incentives of the base token. And now we can go even further, and this gets into the really cool territory, is that although it requires nothing to start the chicken bonds, a project can decide to support its own instance of chicken bonds through several ways. And so essentially the only thing they would need is some balance of the native token. So I don't know, let's put it more concretely with real examples so you understand. Say Uniswap. Yeah, we're thinking big here. So say Uniswap wants to grow the liquidity, the Uniswap DAO wants to grow the liquidity on the Uni token, all right? Well, good news for them is they have tons of Uni tokens in treasury. So they could just do some liquidity mining or Olympus Pro and capture liquidity or raise liquidity. And that would work, but that would be very costly. Instead, what they could do is harness the chicken bonds, where so they would go through all the flow we described with the 3 buckets and so on. The only thing they would need is a yield source, but on the Uni token, it's not too hard to find. And now the cool news is the DAO could actually put the Uni token they use, essentially deploy them to support and increase the yield amplification of the chicken bonds. So how could they do that? Well, for instance, say they just take 1 million uni token that they bond, but they never chicken in or chicken out with them. They just leave them bonded, and so now they contribute extra yield to the system, so they increase the yield premium of the other users that go through it. And so I think it's a really interesting flow that will help the chicken bonds be more attractive to those DAOs and projects. Is essentially you can do it fully low cost, no cost at all, not using your token, not using any other token, and it might be a little bit less efficient. But if you want to give it more firepower, all you need is your own token. And if you have them and you're willing to mobilize them, not risk them, just mobilize them, lose the opportunity cost of capital on them for a few months, for instance, well, you can deploy them within the system to support it and make it more interesting for end users. So I think it's overall just a bit more flexible, a bit more adapted to the reality of DAOs, who they usually own a lot of their own token, but very few of other tokens. And so it enables them to, with this initial situation of tokens, still capture liquidity without having to essentially sell their tokens for the other token of the pair, so usually ETH. So to answer your question, Squirrel, regarding the model only working if there is a yield accrual to the token, it's more, it's a requirement of the system that essentially there is a yield source on your token. Because the whole system, as we described, is a mechanism to amplify existing yield. But I think that's a critical part to understand, is that it does not create yield out of thin air. It amplifies existing yield. And so, one of the natural prerequisites to harness the chicken bonds is that there is a source of yield that can be amplified. Oh yeah, Ron, and for your question of earlier, well, it's funny. We had some discussions early on about how we would easily describe this. It's a bit hard because it's kind of a new sort of primitive, but you could picture it as a way of, for the end users at least, because there are two perspectives and two stories to the chicken bond. Let's say the user perspective and the project perspective. But from the end user perspective, you could describe it as a way of going long on the yield a token can give you. It's a form of leverage yield on the token, yeah. So maybe when I see quite a few of you are typing, I'll let you input your question. Maybe meanwhile, just to kind of move to a more practical explanation, I guess. Do we want to deep dive a bit more into how it would work for LUSD, Rick? Because I think it will help people to kind of see the mechanism in practice.
Definitely, yeah, sure. So with the LUSD version, users will bond LUSD, and that LUSD goes into the pending bucket, and that pending bucket utilizes bProtocol as the yield source. So it's deposited to bProtocol. As probably many of you know, bProtocol kind of recycles the Liquity and ETH gains into LUSD again. So it earns yield on the LUSD in LUSD. And that yield is attributed to the reserve bucket. And yeah, when people chicken in, their bonded amount is moved into the reserve. And if they chicken out, obviously they reclaim their LUSD. Now, with the LUSD version, the goal is to acquire liquidity, but actually to use the liquidity in a certain way. And what we want to do is use the acquired LUSD to actually help tighten the LUSD price peg. So we have two yield sources in the LUSD version, and the second one is the curve 3 pool. So yeah, the LUSD can be deposited to Curve, and it can actually be shifted between B protocol and Curve. And that's a permissionless shift. Anyone can do that, but it can only be shifted if it will improve the spot price on Curve. So that's kind of like how Liquity is benefiting from the acquired and the permanent liquidity. And yeah, everything else is kind of uses those core chicken bond mechanics. It's like when you chicken in, you get this B token, so it would be BLUSD, and that can be redeemed against the reserve bucket for LUSD. And so at the point you get that B token, you kind of got a guaranteed redeemable amount, and that only increases as the reserve earns the yield from all the buckets.
Yeah, and as Rick highlighted, in the LUSD implementation of the chicken bond, we have a bit more logic regarding this shifting function. It's just specific to the LUSD situation, where we wanted to have this system help us improve the peg of LUSD on Curve. For other projects, it could be a different logic, could be no such logic at all. It's really dependent of what are the needs of the project and what they're trying to achieve with permanent liquidity, essentially.
Yeah.
So I saw that there are quite a few questions going around impermanent loss. Yeah, I imagine that's of course a concern. So the way the system works is really, I guess on the LUSD part, it's even clearer. There are sources of yield without impermanent loss. And so, for instance, for LUSD, that would be the stability pool, but through the B protocol. So that translates the ETH obtained with liquidation back into LUSD. And yeah, so the sources with impermanent loss are harnessed at the permanent bucket level. And this bucket is not involved in ensuring that the user can redeem fund at different stage of the system. So that's a way to essentially go around the issue. And then the shifting function has some conditions. I don't know how that would translate in terms of protecting users from impermanent loss, but it should have an impact, right?
Yeah, so impermanent loss is fairly low with the Curve stable swap pool because it's like, yeah, it's stable swap. But yeah, like, and the shifting itself will help tighten the peg, which will in turn reduce the impermanent loss. And so we expect any kind of impermanent loss kind of incurred by the Curve pool to be more than covered by the gain due to the yield from the B protocol portion of the reserve.
So Squirrel had a bit of a follow-up question regarding the project using chicken bonds. So yeah, as you noted, so I'm just going to read it to make sure everybody has it, at least the beginning. It says, for liquidity, the difficult part for the project is getting the USDC or ETH side, not their own token. On that, we agree entirely, and that's essentially one of the logic that went behind the design. The thing is, with Olympus, they do get LP tokens, so balanced ETH, let's say, and their token. But to do it, they also offer a significant discount against the market value of that LP position. And it increases the cost and creates a selling pressure. On our end, let's say our system is much more opt-in. Again, they can kickstart an instance of TokenBrice without using zero of any token. They're not spending any ETH, they're not spending any of their own token. The only thing they're doing is essentially, let's call it like that, deploy a plug-and-play infrastructure on top of an existing yield source. Ideally, in a perfect world, they would even do this with a graphical interface in one click, but we, just to give you an idea, we're not there yet. So the thing is, that would work already. Another thing is, they can make it more interesting by committing some of their token, if they want to. So in that sense, I think it's more flexible than the flow you have with Olympus, where the committing some tokens is a requirement with Olympus. And I guess we need to explicit that quite clearly. With Olympus, they're not just committing the token, they're literally giving them away to acquire liquidity. With the TokenBrice, what they would do is they just park them somewhere, let's say, for a few months to support the system and increase its velocity. And then when they're done with it and they captured enough liquidity, they just take their token back through the different escape hatches we talked about already. So it's much more, much less of a risk and a commitment for the project funds that what it can be with Olympus. But yeah, it's two different approaches, and they both have their merits. But I really truly think there is essentially the TokenBrice approach has less requirements and can prove more flexible in the long run. So there was a question too about what essentially happens with the LQTY gained by the B protocol. So that's for the LUSD TokenBrice. So here again, they are sold for ETH. And then some people expressed concern about the pressure it might create on the token, negative pressure. So this is highly mitigated, I think. Keep in mind that you already have some vaults that are doing that. And, it doesn't prevent Liquity from having some upside still. So, for instance, the Pickle Finance Stability Pool wrapper is already selling the LQTY obtained for LUSD. And, we don't see a massive negative price impact after it launched. So I think it's something the market can stomach. Oh yeah, so I guess Rick, you will be best for this one. Someone is asking if we can do a bit like the GitHub we really like, some numerical examples to show people how it actually works. So he's asking like, okay, I have 1,000 LUSD and I'm bonding them. Like concretely, what's happening?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, yeah. So let's say you bond 1,000 LUSD, and then as soon as you start bonding, you start accruing a bToken balance that's claimable. So you don't it's something you can claim. That increases non-linearly, so it will kind of plateau over time. And if you're the first bonder in the system, it will kind of approach 1,000, and it will get closer and closer to 1,000 over time, but it will sort of slow down. And when you chicken in, you will get you'll get your bToken balance, and then you have that bToken, and you can hold it and do what you want with it, sell it or hold it or LP it. When it gets a bit more complicated is when the system has evolved a bit and the kind of backing ratio of the system has increased. So you would actually have a cap that means you would never get as much bTKN as you have bonded LUSD. But the bTKN has become more valuable because of all the yield that has kind of accrued to the reserve pool. So you might have your kind of bTKN accrual might cap out at like, say, 800 bTKN, but those bTKN would both be redeemable for more than one LUSD and also tradable on the market for more than one. And if you chicken in too early, then like any excess LUSD gets sent to the permanent bucket. So let's say your bTKN gets to has climbed to like 400, but the bond you created is the 1,000 LUSD. Then if your cap is 800, then like half your LUSD will be split off and sent to the permanent bucket, and half will be sent to the reserve bucket. And that's to maintain this like constant backing ratio of the system, which is the ratio of the LUSD in the reserve that backs the bTKN that's been minted. And there's actually a really nice GitHub gist that a user created. I think it was Pteris. And yeah, that's a really nice example. And we're going to be kind of looking at putting out some more kind of step-by-step explainer content on that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, we do realize the model can be a bit dense at first glance. And so this is also why we're going step by step. With first the announcement of the white paper to give you some time to process it. And then, yeah, I guess thanks to your questions, we'll be able to produce content addressing the most recurring questions. And as we get closer to the launch of the LUSD Chicken Bond, I think you should have all the resources to understand the model, even if you don't want to go into the depths of the white paper, which I can understand. So there is Barry Fried asking, what does the revenue look like for the Liquity protocol itself? So there is no direct value capture being set up at this stage. But again, the first iteration is going to be on LUSD. And if successful, it would help solve some significant issues we currently have with LUSDs, which are the liquidity and the peg. So it's not a direct value capture mechanism, but it still addresses the core challenges of liquidity. So in that sense, I think the synergy is quite obvious. It's along the same line for a potential LQTY version of the chicken bonds, where, if deployed and successful, even if there is no value capture, it would help improve the liquidity situation in LQTY, and so that would be a net benefit for liquidity. For the generalized version, we're still kind of considering where we want to go with this, and so yeah, it's still to be defined. Okay. So let me see. I think. Oh yeah, some people are asking questions in the Chicken Bonds channel also. So let me sure I don't miss any. So there was. Let's go to Weimar asking, as a user, what is the use case for Chicken Bonds? Would it just be saving on harvesting fees, playing a game of hot potato with other users? Basically, I am asking what my potential upside or advantage is using Chicken Bonds other than saved transaction fees. So yeah, it's an important point. For the end user of Chicken Bond, the main downside is it's more of the main benefit. Sorry, is like a trade essentially, where he's committing in a longer time frame on the token, because of the bonding process where he needs to wait to be profitable before chickening in. But then once he's gone through that phase, he's enjoying increased yields compared to just staking his assets directly. So that's a game of balance here. But essentially, if you intended to hold a token that you would use in the chicken bonds over, let's say, the next few weeks, months, and you are willing to stomach the additional technical risk that comes with it, it's an interesting position to go into. So there are two more questions. First one goes through, it's an interesting one, Squirrel, thank you. So Squirrel is asking us to put ourselves in a hypothetical situation where we have small project X who wants to grow $5 million worth of liquidity on that token. Like, how would they do so with the chicken bonds? So, okay, I'm gonna assume, Squirrel, correct me if I'm wrong, that project X has a lot of X tokens in their treasury, but nothing else. So what they would do is, and also the other thing that is a requirement of the system, is that there is a source of yield on the X token. So you can stake it somewhere to produce a yield. As long as we have both of these, we have a compelling example. So the project X will deploy their own instance of the chicken bonds once the generalized version is available. And this will enable users to go through the flow of bonding, chickening in, chickening out, as you are starting to get familiar with. So now, as we were saying earlier, that's enough. It could work as such. It might take a long time for them to reach $5 million of captured liquidity without any further help from their side. But that's technically enough already. And if there is traction on the chicken bonds of this project, it will eventually reach that situation. But now the cool thing is they can do several things to increase confidence of the users in the chicken bonds and also make it more interesting for them, provided that they have X tokens to commit. And so what they could do is essentially as follow. They would bond some X tokens themselves, and then they have several options. They can do what I like to call a perpetual bond, because it translates the idea quite well, where essentially they create a bond with a significant amount of X token, and they never claim it, or they never chicken out on it. They just leave it here, and now what it achieves is it contributes the yield generated by all those tokens to the other buckets of the system. And so essentially it increases the yield amplification of the system. Now, another thing they could do, for instance, to help users be more confident in the system is also supply some liquidity on the bToken TKN pool. So to do that, same here, they would go through the bonding process, wait to reach the break-even point. Then they will chicken in, claim the bond, so they obtain bToken, and then add them as liquidity against the token. And so both of these paths can be done at the same time and will improve the attractiveness of the chicken bonds and make it easier for them to reach the target of 5 million liquidity. But no, I just want to stress again one thing just in case. The cool part is all the X tokens we mentioned here that are deployed by the protocol, they are not at risk because they can recoup them at any time, essentially. So it's just they are essentially immobilizing some tokens for a set period of time to give more power, more attractiveness, let's say, to that chicken bond instance. So this is what we mean by no cost. Because, if we want to be very picky with the word, we would say acquire protocol on liquidity at no cost, but the opportunity cost of capital on the token of the project. That would be the mouthful accurately describing the situation. And then Seawalk is asking about the NFT bToken accumulation. Wow. Okay, so Are you talking about when you create a bond, Seaborg, how fast you accumulate the bTokens? Is that the question? Or is that a question about the NFT in the system? I'm a bit at loss. If you can specify a bit. Oh yeah, and both. Okay, so I'll go through it. I just realized, Rick, we haven't talked about the fair price formula yet. Maybe we can just give people a bit context on this one, so they understand like why we put a bounty on this one, and if they want to partake, what they can do.
Sure. Yeah. So we've done quite a bit of kind of internal research into what the fair market price of bTKN should be, and we've looked at different approaches and taken some kind of more economic modeling type approaches with assumptions about users, and then some more kind of purist approaches that are closer to like mathematical derivations. We've not had like much luck kind of reconciling them, and our focus has been on the kind of engineering side more than the pure economic research side. So yeah, we decided to kind of outsource this and say, look, if anybody can come up with a really convincing argument or derivation for a fair price that isn't too reliant on sort of assumptions about user behavior, then we'd award a bounty for it.
And so, yeah, this fair price would be essentially an additional data point in the system, helping users guide the decision, because they have the price of the bTKN against TKN on the AMM, but that's a price on a DEX, so it can fluctuate, and it can fluctuate outside, let's say, reasonable bounds. And so the fair price is a way of reflecting, essentially the correspondence between bTKN and token, but also accounting for the fact that the bTokens are not just a set amount of the underlying token, they are a set amount of the underlying token earning additional yield. And that's where the tricky part comes into play.
Just to pick up on the latest question there from Ration Vortex, they said, are we using agent-based simulations? Yes, we have. We have used that with different fair price approaches, and yeah, the results have been like a bit tricky to reconcile. Like, depending on the formulation for the fair price, we end up with different kind of results. So that's something we'd love to see somebody else come up with if they have like a convincing formulation for the fair price, and then run that through either maybe our simulation or their own simulation, and then see what results that yields. That would be great.
Yeah, and for those interested in the bounty, I'm just resharing in the chat. We have a page on the doc kind of giving you more context on the different approach that were tried and what we're looking for. And on the doc, you'll also find a resource tab where you have some modeling tool and a few other resources that should help you if you are looking to tackle this bounty. That will be rewarded if solved with 100,000 liquidity. So I guess we haven't mentioned that yet, except in the tweet. So yeah, that's, if you have the brain for it, that's definitely, I think, a very interesting challenge. So just to go back on Seawalk double question. So I guess for the first part, the accumulation of bTKN when you bound. So you go onto the chicken bond, you create your bond. This is where you receive the NFT. The NFT is like a proof of deposits of your bond, but it's also working like a Uniswap v3 LP in the sense that it contains a claim upon the asset. So if you send that NFT to someone else, you've just transferred the whole bond to someone else, including the option for him to chicken out and recoup the full initial investment, or chicken in and recoup bTokens. Now, for the accumulations of bTokens within a bond, it is indeed time-based, and so it happens progressively, but there is a stage that we call the break-even point, where essentially if the user chicken in, so if he confirms the bond, he will receive a balance of bTKN that amounts for more TKN that he initially deposited into the bond. Hence the name break-even point. So yeah, that's the main logic behind this idea of waiting for the proper time to chicken in. And then for users who want to compound into the loop, they can, of course, once they obtain an amount of bTKN that correspond to more TKN that they initially put in, they can always, of course, exit the system. So it means go back to the TKN, so LUSD, for instance, by swapping the bTKN to TKN or using the redemption mechanism, depending of the situation. And now they end up with more token that they had before going through this first loop. And so you can essentially repeat the loop with an increased amount of token. That's what we call rebonding. And yeah, maybe just a bit more, let's call them more like tease about those NFTs. So I was saying there are technical NFT like Uniswap V3, because each NFT is unique. It depends on your bond, and each bond is unique because it's defined by its creation date, the assets put into, and the amount. And so each situation leads to different outcome. And now we're looking to go maybe a little further on this NFT side, where we're working with some NFT artists to see if we can have something really enticing in terms of it not just being a technical NFT, but it would have a visual identity of its own. But yeah, I guess at this point I will leave it at here, just to manage expectation, because it's still being worked on. But yeah, we picture the NFTs as like an actual key part of the system, and not just a nice to have. And they do add a functionality, let's say, which is that you can transfer an ongoing bond thanks to this NFT. And so if the bond is all fresh, honestly, it might not be interesting to resell it, because you can just chicken out and we keep the initially invested asset. So if you waited just one day, that's not a big deal of losing 1 day of opportunity cost of capital. But if the bond is already, let's say, a few weeks old, so not ready to chicken in yet, but that would be sad to chicken out at this point. Let's put it like that. That might be interesting to resell it as an NFT if you want to move away from the position at this stage. So yeah, I realize it's been an hour already. So feel free to add some more questions in the chat. I think there's still some points that are not fully answered yet. I'll go through again to make sure we haven't missed anything critical. Yeah, if I overlooked your question, like you can just put it back again. But yeah, maybe just as you type your question, just to stress this one more time again. So it's really a progressive rollout. This is a new concept. We've done some modeling. We've done the work in terms of making sure the code is safe. That's for sure. But there are still some things that pertain to how users will interact with the system, and this we can drive hypothesis on. But essentially, we need to release it to the market to see what happens for real. And so this is really at the LUSD chicken bond stage. So when we roll them out, that we'll have a more precise idea of how this works in the wild, and we'll be able to validate the assumptions. So that would be the next highlights for the chicken bonds. We are aiming for this to happen in the coming months. Let's say, coming months. For now, I think it's safe. And then we see the learnings of the LUSD chicken bond rollout. We'll be able to inform the generalized version a bit more and start to have it ready for other DAOs and projects to use. We are also considering another step where we'll try the generalized version first with the LQTY token under the same logic that, this is a novel mechanism. There are some unknowns. So we'd rather try it with our own tokens, prove to the world that it worked as intended. And then it would put us in a great position to advertise it to other projects and DAOs if we were able to indeed confirm that it works and demonstrate, with on-chain data that it had a positive impact. So I guess this one's you will be more precise than me, Rick. We have quite a few questions in the chat regarding the cap, the accrual of bToken, and when we reach the break-even point, and the logic behind all of that.
Yep. Is there a particular one?
Yeah, so there's the last one from Miha, for instance. Is the cap for a bond set at the time of creation of a bond, or is the cap determined when chicken in?
Okay, yeah. So the cap is based on the backing ratio of the system, and that's so just again the backing ratio is the ratio of LUSD in the reserve to the outstanding bToken supply. But that can actually change over time dynamically, so it can increase when yield events occur. So when yield is harvested, that will actually increase the backing ratio because it sends funds to the reserve without changing the bToken supply. So yeah, the cap can slowly decrease over time, and that's reflected in so if you're approaching the cap, you might see that it decreases as time goes by, basically. But it's a global cap, so it's like everybody is kind of subject to the same backing ratio.
And there is a savvy question too about the first person that chickens in within a given instance. Okay. So I was Curiosity Mug asking, so only the first person protocol itself that chickens in has the benefit from avoiding the allocation into the protocol bucket. So essentially the logic of the split and how it evolves depending of the stage of the instance.
Right. So yeah, we just kind of define arbitrarily that before the first chicken in, the backing ratio is equal to 1. So the cap, if you bond 1,000 LUSD, the cap, the first bonder will be 1,000 bTKN. So their bTKN will slowly approach that. But if they chicken in early, so if they chicken in when they've accrued 500 bTKN, then only 500 will go to the reserve and 500 will still go to the permanent, so that they only avoid the permanent, or mostly avoid it, if they really wait until they've kind of really reached that cap or come very close to it. Mia says, can we assume that the accrual of the BLSD is percentage based in relation to the cap? Yes, it's proportional to the size of your initial bond and the backing ratio as well, which determines the cap.
All right. So, yeah, I'll leave you a few more minutes for the last questions and we'll start wrapping this up. So, thanks again to all for participating to the call and for your questions. I understand at first glance the concept can be a bit dense. Keep in mind that it's because we're presenting right now the whole concept, the whole design of the chicken bonds, as introduced by the white paper. As we move closer to the release of the first instance of the chicken bonds, so the LUSD chicken bonds, we'll obviously provide you with content and elements to understand this from a user perspective. So I guess it would be probably easier to grasp at this stage because, in the case of the LUSD chicken bonds, the project is already, let's say, won to the cause. So it's really more about helping you, potential users, potential, let's say, current holder of LUSD that might be interested into making more with them, to explain how the system works and how you can harness it. And then as we move forward and we approach the generalizable stage, we'll be more in a stance where we are addressing other projects and DAOs to help them understand how they can harness this design for their own project. So it's really, it's happening in several phases. And the first big landmark for us would be the LUSD chicken bonds, seeing if they're able to achieve significant traction. Then if they do, or did it translate into actual positive consequences for the project? So in our case, having a better liquidity on LUSD overall and LUSD closer to its peg.
I have a question from Mystery Box. Asks, will this be contracts on chain that other projects can use? Yes. So the intent with the general chicken bonds system is to have like a permissionless protocol that projects can use to deploy their own single chicken bonds instances connected up to their like yield source of choice. So it will be like a kind of chicken bond factory. But the initial one, as we said, is a specific LUSD chicken bonds instance.
All right. Well, seems like Mystery Box question was a wrap. So yeah, we're looking forward to the the chicken bonds drag and drop factory. That would be wonderful if we reach that stage. But before we get there, well, first validate the model with LUSD chicken bonds. And so, we'll be looking closely at how the market react to that, and if the assumptions regarding the improved situation on LUSD are confirmed. So I guess that would be it for today. We'll be sharing in the next few days more content to explain a bit more closely the chicken bonds from a user perspective, because it seems to be like still there are some questions on this front. So regarding, to better understand the system in terms of what you want to do with it, waiting for the best time to chicken in, what are your options at every different stage of the system, and so on. So meanwhile, feel free to ask any further question in the Chicken Bonds channel, and let your GigaBrains friends, if you have any, know about the research bounty. It's quite a generous and attractive bounty, so I'm sure there will be interest. But again, it's also a bit of a highly technical question, so it might not be accessible for everyone. But it's a chance to contribute to quite a cool product. I picture it. So if you have some friends that might be interested by that, feel free to let them know. And if you yourself are interested by the bounty, I guess you can ask your question we have a dedicated channel on Discord, the Fair Price Formula Bounty. So you can ask your question there, and we'll direct you to the resource, or even maybe a team member if you want to have more personal interaction. Let's say it like that. All right, then. Thanks to you all for joining today, and thanks, Rick, for helping me out on this first community call. There will be more of them as we move towards the next phases of the release. And we'll probably be doing also some more outward-facing audio events. So probably a Twitter space.
All right, thanks everybody.